Hello everyone, this is Omar, just giving you a really quick tip or highlight of a few things in the procurement chapter. So PTA is our last formula to remember for our formulas brain dump. The point of total assumption really only applies to firm fixed price with incentive fee contract. It does not apply to any of the other 8 or 9 contracts that are discussed in the PMBOK. So just so you understand, you should expect to be asked specifically by the problem to calculate the point of total assumption, just to give you an expectation of how will that look like in the test. I actually did not have any question that would ask me the PTA, but I saw some of these in my practice exams. So the formula is pretty straightforward, because you will be provided with this information either in bullet points, or I guess the numbers can be embedded in the paragraph of the problem. But just so you understand, target cost, target fee, target profit, sharing ratio, 60 buyer, 40% the sellers, ceiling price, and actual costs can be introduced in other type of fixed price contracts. If you do have to calculate the PTA, again, pretty straightforward algebra. This number, 183,333, is the break-even number for the seller or the vendor to know if they're going to make a profit on the project. So they should calculate this number before they agree to this type of contract. In this case, you can tell that the actual cost of the project was $210, so that makes a bad scenario for the seller. Excuse me. And not only that, I think this is a really tricky part of these type of problems. Let me get my pen activated here. Know the distinction between ceiling price and actual costs. Ceiling price means the buyer agreed before the project started not to pay nothing above 200K. So the actual cost, this extra 10K that was incurred, is the responsibility for the vendor to pay, or just the responsibility for the vendor. So new concepts, again, we just talked about the point of total assumption. The weighting system is something I talked about in the risk management chapter. It can also be called the multi-criteria decision analysis. So that's just another word for weighting system. I don't know which one you already know, but I think it's good to know what some of these concepts really mean. It's the exact same thing: weighting system and multi-criteria decision analysis. And this can be used again for scoring risks once they are identified, but it can also be used for giving a score to potential vendors. So how do you select the best vendor for your project? That's because of the source selection criteria that should be in the procurement management plan, and we'll talk about that in a second. Some new acronyms, and again, the PMBOK is filled of acronyms, so let me activate the pen again. I actually brought some additional 4 acronyms that are really not covered in this chapter. I just want to briefly bring them back. But these 4 are: the request for information is really not a contract type. It's a simple, RFI it's a request from the vendor to the buyer to get more information on something, or vice versa, but it's really not a contract type. A more formal contract type will be these 3 according to Rita. And the invitation for a bid is really used a lot in the construction industry. It's when you have a design already implemented, a blueprint, and you're just trying to get the cheapest or more or cost efficient price that you can get based on the vendors. What's the cheapest price for the design you already have? It can be a really straightforward sort of contract. A request for quotation is used a lot on short-term projects, which speaks to time and material. It also goes well with time and material. I'm trying to write here time and material, but it's really hard. So think of dollars per hour, right? So an existing product can be, think of a hurricane that destroys a bridge that needs to be repaired. So you know that the bridge, what it already looks like, it just needs to be repaired. Therefore, a short-term project just to repair that bridge would have a appropriate request for quotation procurement. A request for proposal is more for a new product, so a new technical product. It can be software. But one thing to know about RFPs is it will always incur in a lot of negotiation. And that's because the vendor will engage in a creative process, while trying to define that product. So negotiation is expected on RFPs. These four acronyms are related because of the breakdown structure. And we know what the WBS is. I just want to point out to you, a breakdown structure can also be an organizational, which speaks to, it's another word for organizational chart. And a resource breakdown structure or a risk breakdown structure are also two concepts. They have the exact same acronyms. I just want you to understand that a breakdown structure, the easiest way to understand some of these concepts is with a visual aid. And that's what I try to do excuse me, in this slide. This is not a PMBOK breakdown structure. I just made this up. I thought it was an easy way for you to picture all the contracts, which I'll not go into, but also look at the risk that either the seller or the buyer assumes based on the contract types. The procurement knowledge area, we know we have four processes, but I really want you to understand this last one because it does create some problems in terms of how it's organized. You might think you can close a project or a phase before you close on a contract. That's not the case. You have to close all contracts before you can move on to a different phase or to close the project. So that's sort of vice versa if you are used to think of straight left to right, top to down organization of processes. And just to go in depth into some of these processes, I really think that the hardest part of this chapter is just to understand what happens in each of these processes. So let's go over a few things, major things that happen inside each of them. On the planned procurement management process, you have to make or buy decisions as a project manager. You have to either decide whether the project team is going to internally make whatever is required, or outsource it and buy it from a vendor, or outsource whatever is needed. That decision happens while you're planning. You also need to establish the criteria to pick the vendors. That's what it's called, source selection criteria, and that's where you use the multi-criteria decision analysis that I was talking about. And this process ends with the preparation of those procurement documents. Conduct procurement starts with sending those documents to the sellers. That's what starts this process. And it also ends when you receive, not only when you receive the information back from the seller, it ends when you finalize the contract. Let me skip or advance my bullet points. When you finalize the contract, it means you have signatures. It changes from a procurement document to a contract. So everything that happens within conduct procurements will start from sending those documents to getting that signature. Then you move on to control procurements, and this concept of contract change control is just another way of saying the ICCB, the Integrated Change Control Board, just for the vendor. So when you negotiate something, you negotiate a change, or a request is received, you go into the contract change control to change the contract, but that happens here only with the vendor. It doesn't really go into the ICCB. Claims administration are just claims that need to be addressed, that the vendor might give to you, anything that might be a problem. Obviously, will also go when you audit those procurements in the closed procurements phase. But the claims just start here, are addressed in the controlled procurements area. You have to keep records of everything. That's what PMBOK calls records management system. Not only records of payments, but records of emails. Every documentation has to be recorded for auditing purposes. And in this process, you start making payments. Not your final payment, that happens in the closed procurement area. So the final payment is made here, besides other things like, for example, alternate dispute resolution. This is further negotiation that might end up in litigation or some sort of mediation. And lastly, some admin closure happens as well in this specific order. Obtain acceptance might refer to the vendor obtaining acceptance from the buyer, and also means that you have to communicate that to the rest of the stakeholders. That's what I mean by final report here. What I mean by lessons learned is related to this one, release project resources. You can't get lessons learned if you release the project team. So it's important to know that there's a specific order for the closed procurement process.